Hello. It is my pleasure today to give this presentation on the differences between communism and a resource-based economy. The title of the presentation is A Comparison of Communism and a Resource-Based Economy, Suggestions for Informed Discussions and Planning. It was originally given at the meeting of Moving Forward and RBE Learning Network on the 6th of August 2017. For those of you that have not seen my earlier presentations, my name is Charlotte Wenner. I'm a Master of Education and a Certified Counselor, as well as a former member of the RCP Maoist Party in the USA. The subject of this presentation is how the knowledge of the similarities and differences between Marxism and communism and a resource-based economy can provide RBE supporters with valuable information for discussions with the public, for deeper understanding, and for planning in the future. This will be an in-depth coverage of the topics, and we'll cover the following points. First of all, we're going to have a definition of terms to make sure that everybody knows what I mean when I talk about communism and when I talk about a resource-based economy. Then I'm going to look at the background, principles, goals, and history of communism, and round that off with the things that can be learned, both what worked and what didn't work. Then we're going to turn to the resource-based economy, again, the background, the principles, goals, and history. And after that, we can make a comparison of these two systems. Finally, I'm going to round off the presentation with some topics that you can consider to handle in your discussions and ways that those can be addressed. It is the express aim of the presentation for listeners or attendees at the presentation that they will have a clear idea about the sometimes perhaps inconvenient truth that there are some definite similarities between communism and socialism and a resource-based economy, but that this should not be seen as something to be defensive about, but rather as evidence that the scientific method has been applied to those social experiments of the past in order to improve on them and make a workable system of holistic change, a resource-based economy. Now, although I know more about these topics than a great many lay people, I am not an expert, and everything I express in this presentation is my own opinion based on my own research. Those who have spent years studying Marxism or have been years in the teaching circles of the resource-based economy will possibly know more about these things. Still, during pauses between the sections, I will attempt to answer questions on the systems themselves if it's necessary. And that's why it's a long presentation. I will do that after each of the sections. At the end of the presentation, however, I hope that questions and discussion will center on the difficulties that people are having talking about communism in an RBE with people in the public, so we can look at how to address these questions and these difficulties together. So let's first begin with a definition of the terms. For any analysis has to proceed from a clear idea about what it is people are talking about. So that's why I want to start with a definition of communism and of an RBE. Furthermore, there are few subjects which could possibly require such a clear conception of the terms, because the words socialism and communism are incredibly value-laden terms, at least in Western society. Most people have a strong emotional reaction to the words communism and socialism, and this is something that we have to deal with and be aware of. First of all, we need to look at how our own feelings are about talking about communism and socialism in relationship to a resource-based economy. For some of this is very difficult to do, and that's owing to the years and years of negative media, negative propaganda, all kinds of advertisements about the bad sides of communism and socialism, which we grew up with. So this is something you need to be comfortable for with yourself if you want to be comfortable in any discussion with people outside of the RBE. However, a correct definition of communism is a practical help when you want to get things clear and you want to work at a non-defensive way. Now, to begin with, Marx himself had 3 definitions for communism, and you have to be clear which one we're going to be using here and which one you can use in your discussions. We are going to be talking about communism as it is discussed in the Communist Manifesto, not about the 2 earlier forms of communism which Marx discussed. We are not going to talk about primitive communism, which was practiced by pre-Neolithic tribes, hunters and gatherers. And we are not talking about raw communism, which is another word for socialism, in which the dictatorship of society is through the proletariat or the working class through a government. It is also, the communism that we use here is also not used in the same way it is used for the communist state, which applies to the USSR, starting with Khrushchev, and in China, starting with Mao. Neither of these countries, although they call themselves communist, are using the word in the same way that we will be in this discussion. A resource-based economy will be the type as outlined by Jacques Fresco and advocated by the Venus Project and the Zeitgeist movement. I will not be talking about transition societies such as one small town, etc., and I will not be talking about an economy of a country whose gross national profit or gross domestic profit primarily comes from natural resources like the USSR, Suriname, and Norway. So now that we know what form of communism I am referring to in this presentation, let's turn now to a discussion of it. I'll begin with a brief look at the background information on Marx, both his personal background and ideological influences. Then I'd like to look at 3 major areas where the principles of communism are arrived at, those of philosophy, political science, and economy, and then look at the history of communism, Marx's personal efforts, the Russian Revolution of 1917, and the Chinese Revolution of 1949. Now, it may seem unnecessary to talk about the background of the people who came up with these ideas in any detail, since we're looking at the schools of thought themselves, but I do want to do so for a couple of reasons. First of all, I want to make clear that these, both Marx and Jacques Fresco, are people who have been influenced by the culture and the environment of their times. So their ideas also arose as products of their time and culture. And they need to be looked at that in that context. Furthermore, I'd like to keep the idea that these are just men, just people, and avoid any kind of transference or projection leading to idolization or a cult of the personality. As these ideas were products of their time and of their environment and culture, it is theoretically possible that anybody else at that time could have come up with these same ideas if they are in fact true. So in that sense, I don't want to emphasize the importance of these men in particular. But projection is natural and it happens quite often. It's a necessary defense of our cognitive associative memory. And it happens all the time, but if you're not aware of the way you use projection, it can work to distort reality. For instance, as I talk here, if you are having a very positive or a very negative reaction to what I say, it could be that you're projecting somebody else out of your past, a teacher you hated, a teacher you loved, something like that. And whenever these kind of strong feelings come into a situation, it reduces your ability to be objective. So that's why I mentioned we don't want to project any superhuman abilities or genius on the people that came up with these ideas, but just see them as products of their time and culture, like I am. So, first of all, what was Marx's personal background? Well, he was born in 18 in a family of middle-class bourgeoisie, which means the upcoming class in capitalism. And his family had property in wine vineyards. He married a woman from the aristocracy and was a member of the intelligentsia. He had degrees in law and a PhD in philosophy. So his class background made him a rather transition figure in the sense that the intelligentsia can very often be won over to revolutionary or future-directed ideas, even though he came from a middle-class bourgeoisie background. The strongest ideological influences on Marx were philosophy, and particularly Hegel's dialectics, and the French philosophers, such as Voltaire, of the revolutions. But Marx differed from Hegel in that he was not idealistic, materialistic. The American and the French Revolution also inspired much of his thinking, and the industrialization that was taking place in London influenced his analysis as well. Now, I mentioned materialism and idealism, and before we go further, I would like to very quickly define these terms as well. You have three schools in philosophy about a way to arrive at truth. You have monism, or the study of one thing, mono. You have dualism, or the study of two things, or the influences of two things. And you have pluralism, that's of more things. Now, monism, or the source in one thing, has two forms. You have materialism, which says that all things come from the result of material interaction. And you have idealism, which says that reality and all its products are constructed by mental processes or immaterial processes. So these two monisms are directly opposed to each other. Then you have dualism, which says that both the material and the mental causes are what causes reality. So two things are essential to this system. And finally, pluralism is used to mean a doctrine of multiplicity, or many things. And there are a few examples that are used in metaphysics. For example, in epistemology, they say that not one single way of finding the truth is true about the world, but there are many. For instance, when you have a pragmatic or relativistic look at things, or in the saying, all roads lead to Rome. Then in logic, you also have pluralism when you say there may be more than one correct type of logic. For instance, classical logic is the correct logic generally, but paraconsistent logic, or an alternative logic, is the correct logic for dealing with certain paradoxes. You see this pluralism also in the way that science or physics now deals with the classical and quantum physics, that different laws apply. So these are some basic terms in philosophy that we'll be talking about in the process of this presentation that I wanted to define now. Now, as I also mentioned earlier, Marx was greatly influenced by the study of dialectics, particularly that of Hegel. Dialectics is again a process of logic, and you use it to arrive at truth by resolving contradictions. So two opposed points are resolved, are brought into harmony, and that is the process of dialectics. Now, as I also said, Hegelian dialectics was based on idealism. So Hegel said that there was a contradiction within the concept that had to be resolved for truth, and versus materialism, which Marx said was true, and he said that the contradiction was always within concrete circumstances. But the term dialectical materialism was never actually used by Marx, even though many people think of it when they talk about him. He did define historical materialism. Historical materialism was simply the study of history showing how that the material conditions of production and their social relations are what determined how society was organized and how it developed. Engels also emphasized the process of evolution in social change, and he said that the evolution was the result of a process of higher levels of existence being reached through the struggle from the lower forms of existence to get higher. And that's why he said that the proletariat, or the working class, or the lowest class, had to be the one to rule the final society, socialism, because by them being at the top, there were no other classes beneath them, and that's how classes would disappear. The term dialectical materialism was actually developed by Stalin and further used by Mao, especially in the Great Leap Forward and in the Cultural Revolution. Now, Marx's analysis of the process of the revolutions which preceded his birth caused him to make an analysis of society into 6 stages. Each stage created a new class or invention that would lead to its downfall. This was the internal contradiction which his material dialectical look at history was the result. Now, the first 4 states were primitive communism, slave society, feudalism, and capitalism. And if you look at how these stages changed, you can see that they were overthrown by lower classes acquiring more rights in the establishment of the new society. So, for instance, capitalism, which came out of feudalism, was when the aristocracy had to give some of their power up to the emerging merchant class because they were making so much money. These changes in the form of economy and state were actually beneficial because the invention or the class, which would eventually overthrow the previous, brought about much development and material wealth. And socialism was the only stage, he said, that would not have any negative consequences, but would lead to the higher form of communism under the leadership of the working class. However, Marx believed that the capitalists would never give up their power and that armed revolution would be necessary. And even in socialism, there would have to be constant revolution because of remaining capitalist or bourgeois influences. So these constantly had to be rooted out in order for the society to move into communism. Another important area of communism that should be understood is how it looked at the economic situation. Marx analyzed in great detail the internal contradictions of capitalism. One of the most major contradictions was supply and demand. It was theorized that in order to make profit, there would have to be infinite supply, that is production, generating profit, but that this would meet a finite market. Everything they made would not be able to be sold because everybody would already have one. Moreover, within capitalism, within the free market, there would be more and more producers of these products, and this would flood the market, eventually lowering the cost of each of the products, requiring more production and new markets. But even these new markets would be finite, and the costs would could not indefinitely be reduced. So the system would in some way collapse. Moreover, in looking for new markets and ever cheaper ways of obtaining resources and labor, there would be increased aggressiveness of the competition. And when this reached a national crisis level, countries would go to war at each other in order to redivide the resources and markets to the winners of the war in the international context. But besides the economic side of the contradictions within capitalism, there was also an internal contradiction of the newly formed working class. Again, as mentioned earlier, Marx had analyzed that every new economic system always had an invention or a new class which would overthrow it. Capitalism had both of these. On the one hand, he believed that work was an actualizing function for most people, and that they were aware not only of their reality, but of what they were capable of. But because their labor was ever more specialized, they were more and more removed from the actual product and the pride in having produced something, they became more and more alienated from the work they were doing. This alienation caused them to be very dissatisfied with what the reality of their situation was and what they could possibly be. They realized they were not living out their potential, but they were just some kind of cog in the machine. At the same time, the industrialization in 19th century England supported, of course, the capitalist need to reduce production costs and increase production. But it made the alienation of workers even worse, and it brought it to unbearable levels of dissatisfaction. So Marx believed that this would compel the working class to revolt, and that they would overthrow the owners of the means of production and take power into their own hands. As I mentioned earlier, socialism was a definite stage of history in Marxist theory. It was the stage of economic development that preceded communism, and it was different from a lot of other different definitions of socialism. For one thing, the sole criteria, the only reason that things were made, was because they needed to be used. So there was no profit value or law of value, but there was only use value in the decisions for production. So that meant that the law of value and profit no longer related to economic activity and did not direct it. The production for use was coordinated through conscious economic planning, and the distribution was based on how each person had contributed to it. The social relations under socialism would also be quite different. The working class would effectively own their own means of production, the means to their livelihood, which would mean that any surplus that accrued or gathered would go directly to the working class. It would not be saved or hoarded by any private individuals, or it would be distributed to the socialist society as a whole. So this was, again, different than forms of socialism that retain a market, or they base it on a mutualism or a utopian scheme. So after a period of socialism in which class division became less and less prevalent, and division and production became more and more free and consciously planned, eventually society would go over to communism. The goals of communism were the common ownership of the means of production, free access to articles of consumption, and was without class or without state. Communism, the socio-economic development of communists would be based on a superabundance of material wealth. And again, this arose from the advances in production technology and the corresponding changes in the social relations that this production made possible. So ideally, communism would eliminate the division between public and private life, the division between civil society and the state, political institutions, private property, and class exploitation. There would be no more classes, so there would be nobody to exploit other people. So these principles are some of the things we'll be comparing with a resource-based economy in the next section. However, before we go on to that, I want to look at how these ideals were put into practice, or people attempted to put them into practice. The first notable date is February 1848, when Marx and Engels published the Communist Manifesto. This booklet was actually a declaration of the intentions of the newly publicized Communist League in Brussels. Before this time, the Communist League had been operating secretly, but Marx and Engels convinced them that if they didn't go public so that people could actively support them and actively become aware of them, they would never gain enough members or support to affect any change. Shortly after this, there was an upsurge in civil unrest, particularly in France and Germany. And because of this, Marx and the Communist League moved to Paris, where he lived for 2 years. But after that, he moved into London because he was kicked out of Paris, and the League was moved there as well. At this time, he had to fight against leftist tendencies who wanted to stage a revolution in England immediately. Marx and Engels said that they shouldn't do it because the working class was still too weak. It would mean if they tried to stage revolution, they would be destroyed. Instead, he said they should join the progressive elements of the bourgeoisie and build up strength. After that, there was a formation of the International Workingsmen Association. This was the first international. Here, Marx and Engels had to struggle against the anarchist left-wing forces. And at the time of the Paris Commune in 1871, this international moved to New York, which Marx thought at the time was a very good idea. But because of this move, his influence was reduced, and he did not really take much part in the activities of it after that. At the end of his life, Marx heard of the uprising or the difficulties in Russia, and he actually contemplated the possibility that Russia would be able to bypass the capitalist stage of development. They were at that time still in a feudal system of peasants and aristocracy. And they could just build up communism in a kind of mere or primitive communist villages which existed there. I'd now like to look at the first real revolutionary uprising for communism that took place, and that was in Russia. As I mentioned, this was still in a feudal stage of development. And under the Tsar, the industrialization was very slow. And at the same time, they were very strict in counteracting any leftist, socialist, or unionizing tendencies. However, he wasn't able to keep these forces down completely, and in 1905 there was a small revolution which forced parliamentary government as well as the Tsar. But the first big breakthrough came when Nicholas II involved Russia in World War I. This brought about a great deal of suffering for the people and caused the dissatisfaction to rise to intolerable levels. The biggest problem was food scarcity, and this scarcity was not because there wasn't enough food coming from the harvests. It was because of the devaluation of the currency. Nicholas had allowed the government to print millions of rubles to finance the war. This led, of course, to inflation, and the prices for food in 1917 were 4 times as high as they had been in 1914. However, these high prices did not translate into higher income for the peasantry, but no higher income, whereas their costs did increase. So instead of bringing their grain to market, they just kept it themselves. It was a lot cheaper that way, and they only farmed for themselves. They went to subsistence farming instead of farming to sell their excess. So because peasants were hoarding the grain, cities were also constantly short of food. This led again to rising prices and strikes for higher wages in the factories. Now, obviously, this situation could not go on indefinitely, and in 1917, February of 1917, Nicholas II was overthrown in the first socialist revolution, led by the Mensheviks. They had the majority of power, although there were still Bolsheviks also in the government. But the Mensheviks kept Russia in World War I, and the population was still very much against this. So the Bolsheviks used this by saying that their party would get Russia out of the war. They used this propaganda inside the Soviets, or the unions of workers, which had arose in 1905. Plus, they also got some support from Germany, who wanted to see Russia move out of the war. So with this support, the Bolsheviks were able to stage the revolution in October 1917. Vladimir Lenin is usually seen as the leader of the revolution, although at that time he was not actually in Russia. It was Leon Trotsky who had good ties with the army and got them to move against the government in Petrograd, which is now Leningrad. Stalin was, of course, also general in that army. Now, this is where the power politics start coming into play. For although Lenin initially supported Joseph Stalin, at the end he supported Trotsky as his successor. Trotsky had a different way of looking at how revolution should be continued. Now, Lenin wrote several documents saying that he indeed wanted Trotsky to succeed him, but these were later suppressed by Stalin in an enormous power play in which Trotsky was forced more and more to the sidelines. The big disagreement at that time was whether or not Russia would be correct to build up a capitalist move to socialist economy and then wait for the advanced countries to stage revolution so that it was worldwide, as Marx had said, or if they should continue their own socialist communist state and try to establish it in their country and then spread out. When they saw that the rest of the world was not likely to follow in this revolutionary surge, Stalin established his policy of socialism in one country and used governmental bureaucracy to establish this form. Now, national communism was a direct contradiction to the Marxist position that socialism has to be global. It had to be world communism. But Stalin was able to seize power. He exiled, and some say killed, Trotsky, and established the United Socialist Soviet Republic in 1921. However, they really did not have a very easy time of it then. For instance, Germany, although they had supported the Bolshevik Revolution, they supported counterinsurgency time and time again with other forces in the Allied power. These counterinsurgent efforts led to much great unrest within Russia until 1923, when the Soviet power was finally consolidated. However, after this time, there was a continued effort from the West to undermine Soviet power in any way and form they could. Russia tried to promote a global revolution by instigating smaller communist revolutions in surrounding countries such as Poland, Czechoslovakia, and Hungary. And this was, of course, also a way of building up a side of allies or a bloc to defend themselves against the Western Bloc. However, it did not do much to promote the actual process of socialism. The state ownership of production and distribution led to a stratification of the population. People in the government were able to get more and more benefits, whereas the working class did not get them. So this was a new kind of class stratification, and it continued to operate using the law of value. Because it was not worldwide, they had to continue to trade with other countries, working with a capitalist economic model. So instead of actual communism, such as usually assumed about Russia, their economy is actually state capitalism. The story of the revolution in China is somewhat similar. Again, they also were in a feudal stage of development when the last emperor Puyi was in power. And at this time, China was divided up between the great allied powers of the Japanese, Americans, the English, the French, and the Germans. But the Nationalist Party developed to rise up against this imperialist occupation. And they had the slogan, nationalism, democracy, land to the people. The nationalists were able to depose Puyi in 1912, but after that, they did not form a very strong government. There was an attempt by the second leader, Yuan Shikai, to become an emperor. And when this fell apart, warlords fought for power within each of the various provinces. But when World War II broke out, the Kuomintang, or the Nationalist Party, which was headed by Chiang Kai-shek, and the Zhongguo Gongchangdang, the Communist Party of China, formed in 1921 and was headed by Mao Zedong. These two parties fought together to overthrow the imperialists in the Second World War. Now, although the Republic of China operated under the power of the Nationalist Party from 1925 to 1948, the Communist Party of China was very much an element. When Japan invaded China again in 1937 through 1945, Chiang Kai-shek supported a compromise with the Japanese. He felt that the economy first had to be built up before they could have any power as an individual country. But the communists said that the Japanese should leave the country, and they were supported by the people. And so in 1949, the Communist Party attained power. Now, the history of the Communist Party of China is perhaps more continued class warfare than had been seen in Russia. But they still had to deal with insurgency from inside and outside. And they too spread revolution to various neighboring countries such as Korea and Vietnam in order to fortify their borders. They also took over Tibet. The last program, the Cultural Revolution, which was headed by the Gang of Four, was the last attempt to continue communist class struggle revolutionary activities. However, when Mao died, power went to Deng Xiaoping, who led his country through far-reaching market economy reforms. Yes, market economy. So strengthening the market economy, law of value, And the socialist stratification, again, government personnel were able to get more favor, more luxuries, as well as the merchants in the free zones, which were given free rein to develop capitalism in their area, led again to state communism, state capitalism, excuse me, not communism. So these lessons can be used in order to find out what we should or should not do with a resource-based economy. I will now turn to a brief review of the resource-based economy. This will be somewhat shorter than the one on communism, as there is more known about it and there's less history. I will cover the same areas as with communism: the background information on Jacques Fresco, the principles, and the history of the resource-based economy as we know it till this point. Now, Jacques Fresco was born in 1916 in a Jewish family of immigrants from the Middle East, also in the middle class, but more working class side, also around the time of the First World War. So this was also going to have a conditioning effect on him. As a wild boy of the road, he dropped out of high school to travel and work, and educated himself for the rest of his life. He had a short stay in the military as a technical designer, but didn't stay there for very long. He worked as designers by various companies, but his ideas were often seen as impractical. He also had a brief practice in psychology. Now, the influences which had the greatest effect on Jacques had to do with the economics of the Depression and also the influence of communist analysis, those of Darwin and Einstein and technocracy incorporated, and the theories of evolution and behaviorism as referring to human development. Now, his ideas about how the economics should be dealt with in a resource-based economy occurred to him pretty much living through the Depression, when he saw that the factories which were closed were only closed because there was no money to run them, but that they were actually capable of producing. The essential point of the resource-based economy is the elimination of money and the formation of an economy of abundance through the strategic use of technology. An area essential to these strategies are environmental sustainability and a holistic use and approach to the strategies. I've listed a film here in which the various strategies used in an RBE is very well presented. Now, when the resource-based economy first became known, various economists attacked it on the same basis that von Mises had attacked the idea of a socialist communist society without money. I've listed here the link to the excellent analysis on these arguments with regard to an RBE, but I would like to summarize the two main arguments as follows. The first argument that von Mises brought about against the possibility of a moneyless society is that he said the medium of money or value is necessary to determine the most effective use of a resource. If a resource is expensive, for instance, that's because it is scarce, and that because it is expensive, it will not be used so much in production. So that would be the medium of the use determined by the money. However, in an RBE, money is seen to only indicate supply and demand, and not all of the costs, the full array of costs, such as damage to the environment, etc. Moreover, the money it costs is only really relevant to the one hoping to make a profit. It doesn't matter to the people who are buying the product if the resource is scarce or plentiful. They only want the product. So this was one argument against von Mises' claim that money was necessary for efficient use. He also said, von Mises said, that if all the hidden costs were taken into consideration, such as environment, costs of labor, etc., storms, competition by other producers, the human mind would be unable to decide which of these elements was the strongest with relation to the other. So the system of evaluation without money as a medium would fail. But an RBE takes a human mind completely out of the equation. They automate these decisions. And it's possible to make an ordinal scale, so saying this is most important, etc., on a case-to-case basis so that each decision is made accurately. Moreover, resource-based economy does not have a universal rule, such as capitalism's maximize profit. It's because the scientific method is always used that each decision is related to specific circumstances. Now, the above description should make clear that the development and implementation of science and technology is essential to strategic redesign. What needs to be emphasized here is the intended use of technology. For a lot of people get scared at the idea of machines making decisions. But it needs to be clear that the intentions for technology in an RBE are much different than in capitalism. When the decisions are not related to profit, that means that they will always be directed for the good of all people and the planet. Moreover, when they don't have to serve some people's interests, there will be much more freedom of thought possible in which it is applied to all phenomena. Fresco also frequently names the RBE a holistic system. Most likely he is talking about the engineering concept, which not only includes a top-down methodology, but a bottom-up. So the combination of these two forms is what he probably saw as a holistic system. Finally, in the area of human development and relations, the resource-based economy has definite scientific basis for its approach. It takes the stand that human behavior is conditioned by material environment and social relations, but is more concerned with how evolution and behaviorism actually forms these. Evolutionary theory maintains that all the correct characteristics that are retained must fulfill some function for survival, and behaviorism only looks at the objective evidence, or what the measured observable response is to stimuli. And it does not look at conscious experience, but merely the responses, the behavior. Now, there has to this point never been a revolution for a resource-based economy, but there have been several developments through history in this concept. It moved from the futuristic designs Fresco made in the 40s and 50s to Project America in 1961. In 1970, he started socio-cyber engineering. And in the 1980s, the Venus Project was born, and Roxanne Meadows became his companion in this. In 2008, he was included in the film Zeitgeist Addendum, which was possibly the most biggest step in gaining attention internationally. However, in 2012, the Venus Project split with the Zeitgeist movement. However, this led to the resource-based economy being taken up as a goal in a variety of groups. The Venus Project is against smaller groups and favors one big group under the Venus Project control. Some of the smaller groups address the question of a transition society and taking over political offices as a way of gaining power and changing the environment, as well as include consciousness-related elements. So in looking at these two systems, we can compare them as follows. I made up this chart, and some of the terms or the divisions may meet some resistance. However, I tried to do this as best I could based on the discussion we have had so far. One major difference is that the theory of Marx included a transition society, that of socialism, as well as communism, whereas a resource-based economy is the end station. It could be that Jacques thought that a transition society would not be necessary. When he was young, he was forcibly kicked out of a communist youth league meeting when he shouted out, Karl Marx was wrong. It could be that he saw that automation was developing and technology were developing at such a level that a transition economy would not be necessary. It could be. I have included concepts from both socialism and communism in any case in order to show the difference. For the economy, there's a decreased use of money in socialism and communism, leading to a state of no money. Whereas in a resource-based economy, there is an economy of no money based on abundance. The production in socialist communism is based on need. Resource-based economy, it's based on need and the evaluation of the cost to the available resources. In terms of distribution, socialism says from each according to his ability, whereas with a resource-based economy, everything is done by machines, and distribution was done to each according to his need, whereas in a resource-based economy, everything is available to everybody. Ownership in socialism would have an initial phase of state ownership under the dictatorship of the proletariat, moving to communism. In a resource-based economy, there is universal ownership of Earth's resources. The technology for Marx was of primitive automation, whereas for a resource-based economy, you have advanced automation and artificial intelligence. Decisions made in a socialist communist society were democratic, initially through the state of the people. The decisions in a resource-based economy were automation programs for the well-being of the people and the planet, based on the well-informed choices of all people. The philosophy of Marxism was historical materialism and dialectics. For the resource-based economy, you could say the scientific method, perhaps materialism. That is a question mark. The paradigm for Marxism, socialism, and communism was a monistic materialism, whereas for a resource-based economy, it is a holistic materialism. Again, I have my questions about this. It's not something I'm certain of. Human behavior was seen in socialism and communism to be formed by the material forms of human relations and the environment. Whereas in the resource-based economy, it is material evolution, conditioning through the environment, and behaviorism. I also would like to provide some quotations from the Venus Point website on the differences they state there are between communism and a resource-based economy. From these quotations, it should seem clear that the communism that is being referred to here is the transition stage towards the goals of communism, i.e. the dictatorship of the proletariat, which has been the case in the world so far and has moved to state capitalism. Now, I'm not sure exactly why they use this definition of communism, if that is done intentionally because most people understand it that way, or if it is unintentional because they did not know that there are various meanings to communism. But these quotes were that the difference with communism is that the Venus Project's aim is to surpass the need for the use of money. Communism has no blueprint or methodology to carry out their ideals. While Marx offered a bold new direction in his time, it falls far short of what can be accomplished with today's technology applied with human and environmental concern. The RBE system uses no money and makes goods and services available without a price tag, debt, barter, or servitude of any kind. Although Marx was a brilliant man for his time, he did not foresee the methods and advantages of a high-tech, resource-based economy. Communism used money and labor, had social stratifications, and elected officials to maintain the communist traditions. Most importantly, communism did not eliminate scarcity, nor did they have a blueprint or the methods for the production of abundance. Machine production, rather than labor, will dominate the future. Perhaps through no fault of their own, they also had to maintain huge military expenditures to protect themselves from invasions of fascistic and capitalistic institutions. Now, some of these quotations directly support some of the things we've mentioned in terms of the transition societies in Russia and China. And others you can use as you deem fitting in the discussions you have with people. So now I'd like to turn to the final part of this presentation, namely considerations you may have for when you have discussions on this subject with people. One of the first things you need to look at when somebody argues communism didn't work, so why should this, is to identify the faulty logic. As Andrew pointed out in the comments to a post by Stephanie earlier this week, this is what is called prima facie argumentation. Hope I said that correctly, which means if A is equal to B and B is equal to C, then A is equal to C. But this type of logic is based on insufficient evidence that's only looking at one possible aspect, namely that both communism and a resource-based economy wanted to get away from the use of money. But as you should have seen by now, that is only one of the various elements involved in these two systems. Secondly, as we pointed out in the presentation on nonviolent communication, sometimes you're just going to walk away. If somebody is deeply entrenched in their beliefs, if you cannot find out what is disturbing, what emotional reaction is propelling the person in the conversation, if they're not open to listening to reason, then you're not going to make any progress in presenting them with facts. Another area that people might possibly react to is the emphasis on the dictatorship of the proletariat, and definitely the types of dictator figures that you got by the idolization of the leaders. Some people might project this onto artificial intelligence. In fact, one Marxist identified a resource-based economy as the technological dictatorship. So it's important that you're able to point out how the RBE will put decision-making and technology into place. Another goal of communism was the division of private and public life, and individual and collective. So you'll need to talk about how in a RBE there's all kinds of freedom for individuality and personal activities. Communist revolution was also based on armed revolution and class struggle. People are going to want to know how an RBE will come into place. If there's not going to be armed revolution, how is an RBE going to be established? We've seen that an advantage for the communist revolution was the unrest through both of the world wars. However, if there is a World War III and the military is mobilized, will supporters of the RBE take up arms? This is another question that needs to be considered. We've also seen in the discussion of the history of communism that different interpretations of Marx's doctrine led to division in the party and power struggles. How does or will the resource-based economy supporters address these issues? The use of language needs to seriously be addressed, that is, the definition of terms. So when we're speaking of holism, how should that be defined? How does this relate to materialism? And Fresco often speaks of symbiotic relationships, but there are actually 3 types. Which one is the most accurate? And finally, one point that was not addressed sufficiently in attempted communist countries was dealing with the hard problem, that is, the question of consciousness. How is the RBE going to deal with that? In all your discussions, it's important that nonviolent communication skills and awareness of any triggers that you may have and that get pushed by certain words is important. So, in conclusion, we have seen in this presentation an analysis and comparison of various elements of socialism and communism and a resource-based economy. We've identified various factors which aided and undermined the success of previous attempted social revolutions. And through scientific analysis, a resource-based economy can address and correct the weak points in Marxism and communism to achieve the realistic goal of a society based on universal well-being. And finally, one quotation which I think is fitting: those who do not remember the past are condemned to repeat it. Finally, here is the list of sources. So if you want to look up these full articles or texts, you can do so at home after the presentation. I want to thank you all for your attention for this very lengthy presentation. I hope you have indeed learned enough so that you're able to talk to people about the differences between the 2 systems, admit the similarities, but show how the difficulties, the weaknesses are addressed to be improved and make a workable system for a resource-based economy. Thank you.